Owning a farm should have meant freedom. No city noise, no pushy neighbors, no unnecessary rules. Just open land, fresh air, and hard work paying off. But that was before Karen. Before her twisted desire for control turned my quiet life into a battle for survival. Before she burned my farm to the ground. And before I made sure she paid for it with everything she had. Before we move on to the story, please remember to like this video. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and leave a comment after listening telling us what you would have done in this situation. Now let's move on. I had grown up on this land. It had been in my family for 3 generations, passed down from my grandfather who had built the first barn with his own hands. I had spent my entire life working this farm, raising animals, planting crops, and running a small business selling fresh produce and dairy. When the town started expanding, I was hesitant. Suburban homes crept closer to our property, and with them came new people, new rules, new expectations. And then the HOA was formed. I never wanted any part of it. My farm was outside their official jurisdiction, protected by agricultural zoning laws. But that didn't stop them from trying. And Karen took my refusal as a personal insult. At first, it was subtle. A few friendly reminders left on my gate, complaints about the smell of my animals drifting into the neighborhood, HOA meeting minutes passively hinting at unsightly properties affecting home values. I ignored it. Then the letters started. Official-looking envelopes, neatly typed notices claiming I was violating some vague neighborhood aesthetic. I threw them in the trash. Then came the fines. Real mailed HOA violations demanding money for things that weren't even illegal. They fined me for my red barn, saying it was not in harmony with the neighborhood palette. They fined me for my chicken coop, claiming it was distracting to homeowners. I wasn't even a member of the HOA. I sent them back unpaid, unread. Karen hated that. The visits started after that. She would show up at my gate, clipboard in hand, pursing her lips like I was some unruly child who needed to be disciplined. She had this way of tilting her head when she talked, like she was trying to sound reasonable, but every word dripped with condescension. "I just don't think it's fair to the community," she said one afternoon, standing at the edge of my driveway, eyes skimming over my horses grazing in the pasture. "What's not fair?" I asked, crossing my arms. Karen sighed. "The way your property clashes with the rest of the neighborhood. We work so hard to keep a uniform aesthetic, and then there's, well, this." She motioned to the land, to my barn, to the animals. "You mean my farm?" She smiled, but it was tight, forced. "Yes, that." I gritted my teeth. "I was here before any of you." Karen didn't even flinch. But times change, neighborhoods grow, and sometimes we have to adjust for the betterment of the community. I knew what she was really saying. Get out. Sell. Let her have her perfect neighborhood. I slammed the gate shut in her face. That was when things started to escalate. The first real warning sign came a week later. I had just finished morning chores when I noticed something off about my goat pen. The fencing looked wrong, loose. My stomach sank. I walked closer, eyes scanning for damage. Then I saw it. The bottom wiring had been cut. Not just broken, cleanly, deliberately cut. Someone had done this on purpose. My pulse quickened as I did a head count. The goats were there, thankfully, but I knew this was intentional. Someone had come onto my property in the middle of the night and messed with my animals. The thought made my skin crawl. I fixed the fencing, reinforced it, and didn't sleep much that night. But it didn't stop. The next week, someone slashed my truck tires. A few days after that, I found broken glass scattered inside my chicken coop. It was an attack. Slow, calculated. And I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen wasn't just some annoying neighbor anymore. She was trying to push me out. And she was getting bolder. I started locking my gates, installing better lighting, watching my back. But it wasn't enough. Because the next time she came for me, she didn't just cut a fence or leave glass in my coop. She burned my farm to the ground. It happened on a Sunday night. A quiet night. A normal night. Until it wasn't. I was asleep when it started. At first I thought I was dreaming, something felt off but I couldn't place it. A weird warmth, a strange light outside the window. Then the smell hit me. Smoke, thick, suffocating. I sat up, heart pounding. Lisa stirred beside me. "What's wrong?" she murmured. Then she smelled it too. And suddenly we were both awake. I threw off the blankets, racing to the window. And my stomach dropped. The barn was on fire. Lisa screamed. I didn't even think, I ran. I sprinted out the door barefoot, lungs already burning from the thick smoke curling through the air. My feet barely touched the ground as I flew across the yard, heart hammering against my ribs. The barn doors were glowing orange. I could hear the animals screaming inside. Hooves banging against wood. Panic, pure primal panic. The metal latch scorched my hands as I grabbed it, throwing the doors open. Thick black smoke hit me like a wall. I coughed, staggering back, eyes watering, but I didn't stop. I had to get them out. The fire was spreading fast. I reached the first stall, unlatching the door. The goats ran, bolting into the night. The horses followed, their terrified whinnies piercing the air. But it wasn't enough. The fire was too strong. I turned for Daisy, my oldest mare. But it was too late. A section of the roof collapsed. Flames erupted. I barely made it out before the entire structure gave way. I fell to my knees, gasping, watching everything I had built burn. Lisa sobbed beside me. And then, I saw her, Karen, standing by the fence, watching, not running, not panicking, just watching. And then she turned and walked away. I knew at that moment, I wasn't just dealing with an HOA president. I was dealing with a monster, and I was going to destroy her. The fire had stolen everything. I knelt in the dirt, my lungs raw from smoke, watching my life's work crumble into ashes. The night sky was glowing orange, the heat pressing down on me like a vice. Lisa was at my side, sobbing into my shoulder, but I barely felt it. I barely felt anything at all. Except rage. Because I saw her. Karen, standing by the fence line, her arms crossed, her face eerily calm as she watched my world burn. She didn't look shocked, she didn't look concerned. She looked satisfied. Then, just as the first fire truck came screaming down the road, she turned and walked away. That was when I knew. I had no doubt in my mind. Karen did this. But knowing it and proving it were two very different things. The firefighters worked through the night, but it was too late. The barn had collapsed completely, the fire devouring every wooden beam, every stall, every tool, and every bag of feed I had stored inside. By the time the flames died down, all that was left was smoldering debris and the sickening stench of burnt wood and animal fur. I stood there, fists clenched, body trembling from anger, exhaustion, and something else. Something dark, something dangerous. I wanted revenge. But first, I needed proof. That was when I saw him, the fire marshal. A tall, no-nonsense man with graying hair and sharp eyes. His jacket read State Fire Investigator, and I knew immediately that he was the one in charge. He approached me, clipboard in hand, glancing at the remains of the barn before turning his attention to me. "You own this property." I nodded, still staring at the wreckage. "Yeah, or what's left of it." "Any idea how it started?" My jaw tightened. I forced myself to take a breath. It was arson. The investigator raised an eyebrow. "That's a strong accusation." I turned to face him fully, my heart pounding. Because I saw her, my neighbor, standing right there, watching. She didn't call for help, she didn't react. She just stood there and then walked away. The investigator didn't react, just flipped a page on his clipboard. Do you have any security cameras? That stopped me cold. The cameras. The ones I had installed just a few weeks ago after Karen started messing with my animals. Holy hell. I bolted toward the house, ignoring Lisa's calls behind me, and practically kicked the door open. I rushed into my office, heart hammering as I yanked open my desk drawer and pulled out the external hard drive that stored the footage. My fingers were shaking as I plugged it into my laptop, scrolling through the timestamps until I found it. My stomach dropped. The footage was clear as day. There she was, Karen, dressed in dark clothes, moving along the fence line. She carried a gas can. I watched, my hands tightening into fists, as she poured gasoline along the side of the barn. Then she stepped back, pulled something from her pocket. A match. I sucked in a sharp breath as I watched her strike it, let it burn for just a moment, then flick it toward the barn wall. The flames erupted instantly. I didn't realize I was shaking until Lisa placed a hand on my shoulder. "Oh my God," she whispered. I swallowed hard and grabbed my phone. 911, what's your emergency? I have proof, I said, my voice low and steady. Proof that my neighbor set my barn on fire. Send the police, now. The cops arrived within 20 minutes. The investigator reviewed the footage, his face hardening as he watched Karen calmly commit arson. That's enough for an arrest, he muttered. The lead officer, a gruff-looking man with a badge that read Detective Harris, nodded. We'll pick her up now. I wanted to be there when it happened. So I followed them. I stood across the street as two police cruisers pulled up to Karen's house. She answered the door in silk pajamas, holding a glass of wine. Her face immediately twisted into a scowl when she saw the officers. Can I help you? She snapped. Karen Reynolds, one of the officers said, pulling out a pair of cuffs. You're under arrest for arson, property destruction, and reckless endangerment. The color drained from her face. Her lips parted, her glass of wine slipping from her fingers and shattering on the porch. Excuse me. You have the right to remain silent. This is insane, she shrieked, yanking her arms back as they tried to cuff her. I didn't do anything. You were caught on video, Detective Harris said flatly. Her head whipped around toward me. And in that moment I saw it. The pure, unfiltered hatred in her eyes. You, she hissed. I smiled, me. She lunged toward me, but the cops yanked her back, shoving her into the back of the squad car. I watched as they drove her away, her screams echoing down the street. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Because the police were about to dig into Karen's life. And what they found would make sure she never saw the light of day again. The next few weeks were insane. Karen's arrest shook the entire HOA to its core. And then things got even worse for her. Because as the police went through her financial records, they found something even bigger. Karen had been stealing HOA funds for years. Over $100,000 in maintenance fees had been funneled into private accounts. She had been using HOA money to fund her personal vacations, home upgrades, even a new car. When the news broke, the entire HOA board resigned overnight. They tried to distance themselves from her, claiming they had no idea. But the damage was done. The HOA was dissolved. Karen tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. Between the arson footage and the fraud charges, she didn't stand a chance. The trial wasn't just about Karen burning my farm down. It became so much more than that. The moment the police uncovered her stolen HOA funds, it was over for her. She wasn't just a petty dictator anymore. She was a full-blown criminal. But Karen, she refused to go down quietly. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, she fought like a rabid animal, clawing for any chance to escape justice. And I made damn sure she never did. Karen sat in the courtroom, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her once perfect blonde bob was now slightly frazzled, dark circles forming under her cold, unrepentant eyes. The trial had dragged on for weeks, but today was the day of the final verdict. The judge entered, the room fell silent. I sat in the front row, my knuckles white from clenching my fists. This was it. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The head juror stood. "We have, Your Honor." The courtroom felt like it held its breath. "In the case of arson, we find the defendant guilty." Karen flinched. "In the case of reckless endangerment, we find the defendant guilty." I exhaled sharply, gripping Lisa's hand. "In the case of financial fraud, we find the defendant guilty." The last word rang through the courtroom like a gunshot. Karen let out a strangled noise, her head snapping toward her lawyer, eyes wild. I smiled. She had lost. The judge cleared his throat, shuffling through his papers. "Karen Reynolds, in light of your crimes, I hereby sentence you to 40 years in state prison. You will serve a minimum of 30 years before being eligible for parole." Karen screamed. It wasn't just a cry of disbelief. It was a full, unhinged meltdown. "THIS isn't fair," she shrieked, lunging to her feet. The bailiffs had to grab her by both arms to keep her from launching herself across the table. The judge remained completely unmoved. "You burned down an innocent man's property, endangered lives, and stole from your entire community," he said, his voice sharp as a knife. "Fair has nothing to do with this." Karen kept shouting, her voice hoarse as they dragged her away. She locked eyes with me one final time. I tilted my head, watching. She wanted me gone. But in the end, she was the one who lost everything. It didn't end there. Karen's house was seized by the county to help repay the stolen HOA funds. Her bank accounts frozen. Every single homeowner who had been scammed by her got their money back. The HOA itself completely dissolved. There were no board members left to salvage it. They had all either resigned in disgrace or had been exposed for being in on her scam. And me. I wasn't done. Not yet. Because while Karen was rotting in prison, I still had one final move to make. I sued her. Not just for the fire. Not just for the stolen money. But for emotional damages, property loss, and attempted intimidation. Her lawyer tried to fight it, but with a felony conviction hanging over her head, she didn't stand a chance. The judge awarded me every last dime she had left. It wasn't just about the money. It was about making sure she never, ever recovered. And I got exactly that. Months passed. My farm was rebuilt. Bigger, better, stronger. I expanded the pastures, added new security systems, and planted new crops. But most importantly, I had my life back. No HOA, no fines, no power-hungry dictator breathing down my neck. One day, while I was out fixing a fence post, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to pick up. "Hello." There was silence. Then a voice I hadn't heard in months. "You think you won." I froze. Karen. She had one phone call from prison, and she used it on me. I grinned. "Karen, how's the view from your cell?" More silence, then a sharp intake of breath. "You ruined my life." "No," I said, leaning against the fence post. "You did that yourself." A long pause, then, "I hope you're happy," she spat. I chuckled. "I really am." Then I hung up. And I never heard from Karen again. If you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Taleflow, because trust me, I've got more insane HOA stories you won't believe.